South Africa is experiencing its longest ever post-apartheid strike. This is in the platinum sector. We're now into 9 weeks into the 9th week of the strike. David Jollie, who's strategic analyst at Mitsui Precious Metals, joins us from London. David, nice to have you with us today. We do this just to test, to make sure you can hear us loud and clear, David. Do you hear us, David?
You're a tiny bit quiet, but I can hear you. So if I look blank, you may need to... yeah, I can hear you.
I did a bit of research in the run-up to this, looking back to the 1922 strike, and then there was a 1986 strike. This appears to be the longest on record. I don't know if you've done your research into it.
I think it's the longest major strike on record in South Africa, but I don't think it's the longest strike because the NUM strike at Northern Zonderendevine was actually longer than this at the end of last year, beginning of this year. But certainly it's a long strike by any standards.
And the implications of it continuing, we haven't seen much reaction yet to the share prices. I'm not, maybe you can enlighten us on the platinum price itself, whether the strike has had much of an influence there. But when will it start triggering investor reaction?
I think it probably did that already to some extent at the end of last year, because it's clear, or the situation, I think, was clearly developing into a likely strike. Even late last year, AMCU was talking about trying to put strikes on at the same time at the major producers and things like that. So probably we saw people building up positions before the strike was announced. In dollar terms, if we look since the strike was announced, actually platinum's lower than it was before, and it's underperformed gold throughout that period. So we haven't seen a build-up yet of panic or worried buying from consumers that would generally drive prices substantially higher. If you look at palladium, I think it's a little different because we have also the Russia-Crimea situation, and then we have the launch of the 2 ETFs, as you were just talking about. So that's a little bit more interesting in the sense there are more factors pushing the price higher, and we've seen more impact, I think, on palladium than we have on platinum, in dollar terms at least.
David, it's Gugu here with Alec. I understand that the strike has impacted about 40% of global production. Is this a realistic number? And if so, what greater impact does this have?
The percentage affected depends on exactly how you calculate it, because there's some refining still going on, some production at some of the affected companies as well. But it's a large amount of metal. I think it's also clear that metal liquidity until very recently has been very good in the market. We see liquidity of sponge, by which we mean powdered metal rather than ingot form, as having worsened, I think, recently a little bit for a variety of reasons. Less metal coming out of South Africa, less metal being sold by refiners and recyclers elsewhere because they maybe think the price is going to rise further. So we see a few things going on there, and it's beginning to have an impact, not necessarily on price, but just on people's thinking, I think, just beginning to make them maybe a little bit more cautious. And I think that you can see that particularly amongst Asian customers, but you can see that amongst customers in general, not panic, not not overt concern, but beginning to be maybe a little bit more thoughtful about what the strike might mean. And I think after 9 weeks of a strike, or 8 or 9 weeks of a strike, they should be thinking about how long can this last and how is it going to end, and what's it going to mean for the industry, after the end of the strike as well.
David, there was an interesting analysis done here in South Africa about the migrant labour system and how that might have a different influence on the way the strike goes into the future. i.e., if workers can go home and work there, remembering that because of migrant labour they have 2 homes, they can go to their homes, survive there, they could actually see this out. And this is a message that AMCU has been giving for quite some time, but hasn't seemed to have resonated yet. Is it an influence, perhaps?
Well, I think the labour relations situation in South Africa is quite different to most of the countries we look at. And clearly the sort of 2-home issue, migrant labour sort of issues, are quite important. I think I have a certain scepticism as to whether it will have a major impact, in the sense that, South Africa unemployment, whether formally or sort of semi-employment or underemployment, is a rather major issue, and whether people can just go back home and then find financial sources of support is questionable. But certainly what it does do is it takes away, if people go home, it takes away the pressure in one location of a lot of people who might talk about maybe trying to end the strike, or the sort of things that might lead to violence, like we saw in the Marikana situation a few years ago. So it will have an impact, but I think one has to be sceptical about how well people can support themselves away from the Rustenburg area. Even if they are at home, even if they have a house there, they still need some income, and if it were easy to support themselves, one imagines that these guys would have been doing that rather than working in the mines, if it were easy to earn just as much money doing something else. So I think a certain amount of scepticism has to be appropriate in this case.
Well, they're not staying in Rustenburg. They're going home to the Eastern Cape. They're going home 1,000 kilometers away to their homes, where they might be able to support themselves. And I'm just wondering whether this has been brought into the equation at all. But perhaps more important, how long must the strike continue for before companies then start hiring different workers or new workers?
I think, as I say, the workers go home and they may or may not be able to earn enough to support themselves there. Some will, some won't, I would think. But I think it's a long distance away before the mines themselves would look to hire new people. I think there's clearly a skills shortage in a lot of areas in the mining sector anyway, more with skilled workers. And I think replacing these guys, training them up, would actually be quite difficult. I think if you saw shaft closures, mine closures, as a result of the strike, then maybe there will be a greater number of people unemployed with those skills, and that might begin to change the picture a little bit. But I think at the moment the desire to start recruiting outside of that group is limited while the strike is protected strike.
David, how's the international community reading the lack of state intervention?
I think it's an interesting question, in the sense that state intervention can be good or bad. I think the lack of continued discussions at the CCMA, the lack of overt state intervention, or sort of certainly public state intervention, is maybe a little surprising. And I think the expectation is, though, that will increase, that we may see more pressure coming along as the strike continues. And we may see more pressure coming along as the elections approach as well. And I think that's a major issue for the ANC and other interested parties, is to try and resolve this situation peacefully and ahead of those elections, and ideally not just a day or two ahead, but significantly ahead. So I think there's a certain amount of surprise, but I think actually in many ways it probably reflects quite well on South Africa that the government is not trying to impose its view. I think the government is trying to encourage people to come to a solution, but that's quite different from saying we will get involved and we will kind of bash heads together. Maybe that has to be the next step, but I think at the moment it hasn't concerned people too much, maybe surprised a few people. I think the interesting question, though, is what will come next, whether we will see the government increasingly involved as we approach the elections.